This week in Common Sense for the first full week of November 2019. 5 pieces, 5 days on thisiscommonsens.com. You're in Virginia, and Virginia went Democrat all the way around, right?
Yes, yes. And Virginia we've been going that way. My county's gone from red to purple to blue. And we used to be a exurban county, I think would be the proper term. And now we're kind of more of a suburban, just because there are suburbs or exurbs communities beyond us, 35 miles, 40 miles, who are commuting into DC to work, or commuting somewhere into this area to work. And so we're kind of seen as more of a suburb, and we're denser. And there's been some interesting things written about density and more dense urban areas are, and I think in some reasonably obvious ways, going to look for a little bit more government regulation. You got people living hundreds of miles apart. They're not going to like, oh, I need someone to look after that neighbor who, no matter what they're doing, I couldn't possibly see him if I ran, if I drove 100 miles to look. That and in urban areas, you're going to have people all constantly coming into contact and wanting, more regulation. So I don't think that's any big shocker. But I also think that the Republican Party in Virginia has just imploded. The Democrats come by, knock on the door, mainly to get to my 20-year-old. But there's Republicans aren't knocking on the door. We used to be a kind of a swing county, so you'd think that they would be. I was going to say that it occurred to me today as I was on a phone call that I just was feeling good, and I was kind of trying to think, why am I feeling so good? And it was the election, I think, this week, and just the fact that there was an election. I always feel good after an election, even when I feel bad.
That requires an explanation.
Well, it's even when I lose, and I might be kind of down, but I still feel good about there having been an election. I feel good even in the failure, that there's the chance to win next time. We start now and we go for next time. There is this process, as convoluted and in need of repair as it is. There is this democratic process, and as flawed as the majority can be in any vote on a person, especially, or an issue. There's a process, and of course, if they told you this is the last election, even if you kind of won, most of the ballot measures and got a few of your, more preferred candidates in, if it's the last election, that's not good news. You wouldn't feel good. But if it's not the last election, there's just something about going through the process. And in Virginia, there's not much to vote for. There were a couple let's borrow money measures locally and spend on different things that didn't seem to be well explained to anybody, that I voted no on, that passed. And my state senator ran unopposed. Not much choice there. And so it's the kind of thing where I'm not saying, boy, elections, we have the best elections anywhere. I don't think we do. But I like elections, and I think again and again they show a nuance to our politics that is completely missed in our representative government. And look, our representative government is on life support, so it's not surprising. It's not news to anybody that, hey, representative government in America is badly broken and not functioning. Everybody knows that. But the way people can do things on ballot measures, and the way blue states make decisions on, in this last election, it was largely blue states making decisions because, on Tuesday we talked about three measures, two of them in Washington State, which has gone from, a very competitive state back in the early 90s, late 80s, I think, maybe through into the mid 90s and stuff, but then has flipped to be a very blue state. There were two measures on the ballot there, and one was I think, kind of a phony, obnoxious attempt to repeal affirmative action while pretending that you were just tweaking it a little bit. And Referendum 88. And it was a petition to the legislature. Legislature then passed it. And it basically changed it to where, Initiative 200 back in, I think it was 98, basically said no racial or gender preferences in education and state employment, and that was very clear. This would have said it can't be the only factor, meaning if there was any other factor, we're going by these 17 factors, 16 of which make 0.0001% of the difference, and the rest is all racial or gender preferences, we can now do so-called affirmative action. And interestingly enough, white folks who might be discriminated against if you're into, hey, I'm white, my skin, and even though I'm not going to college, so I'm not going to be discriminated against, but somebody who's white might be. The people who are, of course, most discriminated against are Asians, who are performing better than Caucasian Americans, and have a lot to lose in getting knocked out of slots. And so they really were the main impetus between a referendum. They had asked the legislature, look, let this go to the ballot, let the voters decide it. The legislature decided it, passed it. That's the end of it, except they took it to a referendum. And thank goodness they have that power, and they beat it. And it was a close election. I believe it was 52-48. I meant to write it down and have it in front of me here so I could tell people, but it was close. But clearly the majority, said, let's keep what we've got. And thank goodness they got that choice. Interestingly enough, there were only 3 counties, King County, where Seattle being one of them, but there were only 3 counties in the state that voted in favor of Referendum 88. Voting no was the way to keep the current, let there be no racial or gender preferences in place. And 52% voted no, against what the legislature had done, which was to pass, is this not confusing enough? Which was to pass an initiative petition to them by citizens on the left who wanted to let's use racial and gender preferences some, because the way to a raceless society is through racial and gender preferences. If that's where they want to go, but once upon a time it might be, and I think publicly it still is. The other initiative in Washington State was Initiative 976, and this set a cap on car fees, vehicle tag fees, license plate fees, and it was pushed by Tim Eyman, the guru of Washington State initiatives, the 98% of the conservative movement in Washington State, it seems. That's overstated for effect. And but he and together with the Fagans and Spokane area and a ton of volunteers and folks put this on the ballot. It basically also stops Sound Transit, the transit government agency, from being able to levy increases on commuters and so on and drivers. So good initiative, woefully outspent, and as we wrote a piece before the election, there were government entities, cities, that were doing things that appeared very clearly to be against the law in terms of trying to promote a no vote on 976. It won by 10 percentage points, 55 to 45, outspent about, I believe it was 4.4 million to 1.7 million. And that 1.7 was almost entirely to put it on the ballot, to pay additional petitioners to go out and get signatures to put it on the ballot. So again, the hate is all about Tim Eyman. We hate Tim Eyman. He's a terrible, evil, horrible person. And interestingly enough, as he points, excuse me, as he points out, he hasn't done. None of these measures have passed because of his vote. All of these measures have passed because the people of Washington have voted for them. And when he's had measures that folks didn't think made good enough sense, he's gotten defeated. But he's been outspent every time. And so it's certainly not the weight of TV ads, which of course hardly ever make any difference, especially in this day and age. But even at any time, people don't decide to change their political philosophy or their basic sense of issues because they see a 30-second TV spot. And that's a problem, not for my side in these initiative battles. We're almost always outspent. And if we could have people read the measure and have a discussion about it, we win. And there are times where you've got an issue like term limits where that's not only true, but it's also true you could explain the issue in about 7 seconds and you also win. But some of the issues are tougher than that. And it makes it, it's not that the public can't understand those issues. It's that if you don't have the resources, the opposition has a leg up because they can smear an issue. If your opposition can smear your issue more succinctly than you can explain it, you're in trouble.
Very good. Here in Washington State, in which I did not vote on Tuesday, forgot all about it. But I know that the only people I heard talk about the car business, the car tax thing, were poor people. It wasn't people who were Democrats or Republicans. It was poor people who don't have a lot of money. And there's a reason why that's it won. I mean, it certainly is not. It doesn't. Rich people can afford higher taxes on their cars, but poor people have a hard time with that.
Well, Tim Eyman, I saw just a brief clip of some news program, and he had gone to testify something because they're already talking about suing to knock it out and so on. But there were people who were indigent in one way or another and looking for government assistance who were, how dare you, propose this measure? And, again, any rational discussion is it really the car tax fees that are expected to pay for all help to the poor throughout the state of Washington? I don't think so. And I don't think that's a smart way. I mean, if that's what the legislature has been doing, thank goodness Mr. Eyman stumbled upon it so that they could fix it and do it a different way. Again, it's this idea that if government gets 1 cent less anywhere, that all catastrophe breaks out, that somehow before government, nothing ever was able to be done. And you have a lot of big government folks. Obama was big with this, and you didn't build that and all that. Elizabeth Warren, I think, was the first to actually make that argument, that you didn't build it, society was there. No kind of sense that, of course, the people who built stuff and made millions of dollars paid a lot of taxes to build roads to their factories, but all of that kind of attitude that they also have the argument that, and Bill Clinton, I can just see making this argument that, government can help people too. And of course it can. And it is right to recognize that it can, because maybe that's where we ought to talk more. that's where, what does government do that might be helpful? And it actually brings us to our third initiative that passed on Tuesday that I wrote about, that it was a great win and continues to build momentum for reform that I love, ranked choice voting. It won in Maine back in 2018 and has faced numerous attacks since then from the legislature and repeals and referendums. And the voters in Maine have again endorsed it at a statewide ballot, using it in the same election, so that if it screwed up, if they did it in some screwy way that didn't make sense, boom, they're going to be, they're going to vote out ranked choice voting. And instead they use it for the first time ever. They like it. It passes again by big numbers. It passed in New York City with over 70% of the vote. And so, New York City and Maine are very different places. Maine's sort of blue these days, although one of the districts, of course, is Trump got an electoral vote there. And is a conservative state. Even liberals politically, I think it's a more conservative state. I think, as I told Rob Ritchie, I'm in full disclosure on the board of Fair Vote, which is a group that supports proportional representation and ranked choice voting and different reforms looking to make the most of democracy. And so, pushing this idea, I told him, I thought, it's just very tough to get folks to pay attention, because they're looking at different issues that more directly affect their life than a procedural reform. But that, of course, the political system is so, what other than a curse word, what word could I use, is so messed up that it just demands these reforms. And I think more and more people are coming to the conclusion that we need a better system. We talked either last week, well, we've actually mentioned a couple of times about representation and how, the average congressional district is over 700,000 people. One person representing over 700,000 people. Why don't you feel at all represented by your congressman? Because you're not getting even 1/700,000th of attention. And so it's just, there are all kinds of reforms that need to come. But again, here we see New York City working on reform, which has got to happen through the ballot box and not through, the crony system there. We see Washington State, a blue state, where the political establishment left says, we want to take back our loss at the ballot box on affirmative action, and we want to take it back without a vote of the people. And yet there's a democratic process that allows a vote of the people stopped. Then they would like to raise taxes, and they would like to, one of the things they've complained about this year is Tim Eyman's advisory votes. He passed an initiative years ago. I say he passed, and again, using their lingo as if he voted all these times. He voted once, but the people of Washington passed an initiative that says, okay, you won't abide by other initiatives we passed that said we want 2/3 of the legislature to pass any measure that raises our taxes, or we want a vote of the people, and then it can be by a simple majority. The legislature has ignored that. So when they don't do that, it goes on the next ballot for the voters to say, do we agree and do we approve of what they've done, or should they repeal their tax increase? They passed 12 tax increases between the last election and this one, meaning this year, this session. Voters said yes to 3 of them and said no to 9 of them. And in looking at the vote on these advisory measures got as many votes, right around the same number of votes that the binding measures got. This is a way for a feedback loop. And they may not like Tim Eyman, But the people of Washington, there were over 1 million people voting on these measures. And they ought to take note of the fact that the voters of their state that elected this Democratic government, I mean, Democratic Party-led officials leading that government, voted against 3/4 of their tax increases. Went to the polls overwhelmingly and said, no, they shouldn't have raised that tax. They should repeal it. They don't pay attention, but in that state, they get to say that. And it's a wonderful thing. And it's why every year when we get past the holidays and January comes, in state legislature after state legislature, in the state legislature in Washington, there's going to be a push to get rid of those advisory measures. One, they're Imans. They hate him. He's the opposition. Let's make him suffer, even if it means we don't get to hear any feedback from the people of Washington. Oh, shucks. That's an added selling point in the Capitol, trust me. And they'll go after the process. And the same is true in a conservative state after an election when they don't like what liberal activists might have put on the ballot. And I might agree with the political position. Oh, I didn't like what they put on the ballot either that passed. But my goodness, are you really going to flush representative democracy and allowing people in that process to represent themselves through a citizen initiative to put their issues forward, to have some say in the process? You really don't believe that's a good thing? I mean, if that's how you think, why don't we just trade you for somebody in Hong Kong? Why don't we just there's so many places for these people to live. And I'm not saying go back to your, where, because I'm sure you were born here. And you don't have to go anywhere. That's the nice thing with a free country. But my goodness, they have so many places in the world where they can go, where there's that sort of attitude. And here, whether you are a liberal Democrat or a conservative Republican, if you're not part of the actual apparatus separating people from their money and spending it, you believe in things like the initiative process and in checks on government and in an election process that's fair and to where whoever got the most votes wins. And then we have a way that we count the vote and there are rules and we follow them. These sorts of, I just about spilled my drink. It's water. Anyway, these sorts of things are universal outside our political elite. And of course, our political elite knows how to talk about them to where they don't sound like totalitarians. But you look at how they think and how they would legislate, especially if you and I don't show up at the Capitol or wherever to vote or to argue or to lobby. We have a huge divide between, I think, political people, and I mean folks like myself who work in politics, and the public as a whole. And a lot of that, I think, is belief in basic levels of democracy. But I do see the more and more that we follow all the blather, right? Red team, blue team, Trump, anti-Trump, and the more we follow that, the more we fall into, I think, being part of that cabal that wants to win by hook or by crook. And once you've got two sides who are willing to do just about anything, well, of course your governance, if your political process is that way, your governance starts to be that way. I don't want to, I can't stand Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump, and I don't want to lock either one of them up. I'd be sad if somehow I thought they committed a crime bad enough that they had to be locked up. And yet we do have, I think, a political process that's urging us to want that sort of governance. And then you turn around and you look at governance like the initiative and referendum process. And there were 36 or 32 measures on the ballot Tuesday. two statewide ballots, the two I mentioned in Washington State, put there by citizens petitioning to the ballot. So often when we're arguing in these states over the initiative process, they'll talk about all the things that have been put on the ballot, all the different measures people have had to put up with, all the constitutional amendments. Oh, they're amending our Constitution so often, and never mention the fact that the vast minority of those are put on by citizens, that the vast majority are put on by the legislature. In California years ago, I haven't done an analysis probably in 10 years, but we did an analysis just looking at measures because they kept saying, well, the initiative process is leading to big spending. All the big spending came from the legislature, but the spending that was done on the ballot, 82% of the spending that was voted for via ballot measure was on ballot measures put there by the legislature, not by citizens. And so here were legislators saying, oh, the citizens are out there spending too much money, as they're, it's like they're drinking this poison. Here, have some. And then turning around and using it to attack the initiative process. I got my start in politics by disobeying a law. I shouldn't call it a law, a statute that has no basis in actual law, by not registering for the draft. And I don't think there's any majority that has the right to force someone to do something that's wrong, no matter whether they got 99.9% of the vote. But the democratic process as a whole has been such a force for good as compared to the alternatives. And it's the sort of thing that I think we have to use more. I especially mean libertarians, and I think people a lot of times, conservatives who are constitutionalists, limited government folks, the left is so strong using the word democracy. And I know people on the left who I think have a very good concept of democracy. And I don't always support where they want democracy to go, but I do support their concept of it. But I think a lot of times on the right, and I put libertarians in the same place in terms of their attitude about democracy, there's this fear of it, as if to say anything pro-democracy is to say that two wolves and a lamb voting on dinner, it's okay if they eat the lamb. And no one I meet going to these conferences around the world, working on the issue in the United States among people all across the political spectrum, nobody I meet who talks about democracy thinks about democracy without basic human rights in law, constitutionally protected. That's the modern concept of democracy. And look, I don't agree with every way that people have moved the language, but languages are malleable. And I think we have to look at democracy and say, is this a concept that is good or bad? And in other words, am I going to say good things about democracy or not good things? And I just think you look at it, and it's the only, if three people are going out and trying to decide what movie to go to, they generally vote on it, or five, it's not as if the only time we would use it is when, we're deciding whether to invade, East Asia is going to invade Oceania or something. So anyway, it seems to me that we see again and again in the direct democracy, initiative and referendum realm that voters don't always get it right, but they are thoughtful, and they often do get it right. They get it more right, I think, when they're voting on issues when they're trying to decide whether candidate A or candidate B is going to go to Washington and do the better job.
And I think there's good reasons for that too, which you've talked about before. And in fact, I don't know if I've ever seen The theorists of democracy and political scientists discuss this at any length. It seems like it would be worth exploring more. The difference behavior between an initiative procedure and voting for a candidate.
It's a really you're right on, and we probably haven't talked about it as much as we should. There's the great quote from Grover Norquist with Americans for Tax Reform, who said, and I'll paraphrase him, that the difference between candidates and ballot issues is that ballot issues don't change their mind after they get elected. And it's true that they're written in black and white. And in essence, you can't corrupt a ballot measure. It's clear what it is, from the very get-go, because that's the first thing you have to have. I think also people do not look at the sort of difficult choice it is to choose between, like think about, we can think about Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump. I've got a lot of trouble voting for either one of them. And so, that's difficult. Go back to, I was 16, I guess, Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter. Two people that I think people would say opposite of kind of Trump and Hillary. There'd be people out there who on both of them would say, oh, I love Trump. Hillary's great, But there are probably few people who go, well, Jimmy Carter was the greatest president ever, or Gerald Ford, who never actually got elected president and took over after Nixon resigned and pardoned Nixon, and which probably cost him the election against Carter. But that was very close. But both men were somewhat respected and so on. But what do you get if you wanted to vote for the person who was going to balance the budget, which was, I think, a bigger issue in 1976 than it is today, unfortunately? Who do you vote for? Well, Jimmy Carter said he was going to balance the budget. And he actually did a few things headed in that direction. He did lots of things headed in the other direction too. But Gerald Ford arguably was talking about, looking at the, inflation and different things. And I'm not sure who you vote for. And the difficulties, because in voting, you not only have to determine who has the better policies, you have to determine which policies are going to make the most impact. And you have to determine whether they can actually do in our system what they say they're going to do. And then you also have to determine, and this one I think is the kicker, whether they're honestly telling you anything or whether once they're elected, they're not going to try to do it anyway. So it's like and how do you tell, especially, this is for president or something where you're getting reams of information, but think about for Congress. I think the level of information coming across television network airwaves, newspapers, which nobody reads anymore anyway, apparently, social media and so on is just woefully insufficient. We have more media than we've ever had, and I think people have less information than almost ever for anything other than the top races. Whatever, if your race is top of the news often, then people might know something about it. Maybe not any of the truth, but they might know something. But otherwise, if it's a congressional race, almost nothing is known about it. And which of course feeds into the, I have to send mail and buy Facebook ads and TV ads and online stuff and radio and maybe I can afford people going door to door. Whatever, you've got to reach 700,000 people. 700,000 people making a decision on, personalities and trust and all kinds of variables is very, very difficult. Smaller districts, as we've argued lots of times, would make those decisions easier because you'd know people, you wouldn't be so reliant on TV ads and online advertising and that sort of thing. But what's interesting to me is that when it comes to direct democracy and voting on issues, it's in black and white. People can know about it and can make decisions. And in fact, states as large as California, with almost 40 million people, can make better decisions, I think, at the ballot box like that than through electing people in districts that, at least for their U.S. or for their state Senate, are bigger than our congressional districts. 1 million people in a district. That becomes very tough, I think, in terms of representative government. And so what we really have to do is both fix representative government, but part of that is to inject direct democracy, allowing people to represent themselves, and someday, hopefully, legislators who have some respect for the voters being able to make their own decision. For more Common Sense, go to thisiscommonsense.com.